Hi, welcome. Once again, this is Jennifer. Glad you're here. Now today I'm taking the backgrounds I made in yesterday's video and turning them into cards. However, first I'm going to take those inky backgrounds and step them up and give them a different look. If you haven't watched my video yesterday, I recommend doing so first. I will link to it up here in the top right. Today I'm taking those inky backgrounds that were really quick to make, stepping them up and turning them into cards. I have lots of different technique ideas for you. These are techniques that you can do with any inky background you may create. These are the pieces that I have left over from yesterday. All of these backgrounds are now ready to turn into cards. I'm going to step them up in order to showcase these backgrounds on our cards the best that we can. Let's start with this one of my favorites, that was created with dye inks, water, and a little bit of Tim Holtz mica spray. Again, I showed how to create it in yesterday's video. With this, I thought it'd be best to do an eclipse technique, where we die cut from the background and pop it up to create a pattern, but still showing a lot of the background. I'm using the new Simon Says Stamp Olive Leaves die set. This is quickly becoming a favorite of mine. I'm starting in the middle, putting them kind of close together, taping them in place, and then running through my die cut machine. For this technique, if you want to do a whole background, I think it's best to start in the middle. So I die cut from the background, and I'll take these and set these onto my MISTI Sticky Mat that I've cut down to be a little bit smaller, just to hold those die cuts in place, just so I don't get them all mixed up. I'll want to put these back onto our background, lining them up. You'll see as we go. Now I'll move the dies to a new spot and run them through again. I want these die cut holes that we're creating in the background to be as close together as possible. You can do this technique with any die you have. You could even use a background die to save time if you want. I will continue this process of die cutting from our background and keeping all the little pieces over on that sticky mat. The sticky mat just holds the pieces there so we don't lose them. You could also use a piece of masking paper, press and seal, anything that will keep them in place. Once I'm done die cutting from that background, I'll put liquid adhesive along the back and then glue it onto a piece of white cardstock of the same size. These are cut to 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. Now you'll see the corners are cut off because of the die cutting, but I saved those corner pieces up there on my little sticky mat so I can add them later. Now I want to make sure that this is sticking well to the white cardstock, so I flip it over and I use a clean Tim Holtz Brayer. This is a great way to press pieces together. You could also use a bone folder, which you'll see me do later. Now into these openings, I'm putting some liquid adhesive and then popping in a die cut that I created from white cardstock. So you can see there at the top of the screen, I used those olive leaves dies to cut from white cardstock many times. I'm inlaying these white die cuts into the colorful background. This will create a smooth one-layer background, which you could use on a card. If you wanted to, you could leave it as is, then use the colorful die cuts up there on the left for a different card. However, I'm going to put them all back together. This is just the first step in the process. When I reach the corner like this, I can pop in my white die cut. Then we need to add the rest of that blue corner. So I'll grab it from over there on my sticky mat, put some glue down on our white background, and then pop this in place. This is really like putting a puzzle together. It's easy to do and really relaxing. Once I've popped white die cuts into each of the openings, I can flip it over and cut the excess off the side. That way we'll end up with a smooth background that looks great. You can see how the pieces are inlaid into the background, but we're going to step this up and add lots of dimension. I created a bunch more of the olive leaf white die cuts, so I have them all in a pile there off screen. I'm gluing 3 of the white die cuts together, then one of the colorful die cuts on top. Those colorful die cuts are the ones that we were storing up there on our sticky mat on the top left corner. So basically I'm putting a lot of white dimension behind each of these colorful die cuts. I will then put glue on the back of those stacked die cuts and glue it right on top of the white inlaid die cut on our background. However, I'm going to slightly offset the leaves just so a bit of the white peeks out, which just really enhances that eclipse technique look. So you can see how the leaves line up with the background, but you have a little bit of white peeking from the outside edge just to define the edge a bit. This allows us to show a lot of the background, but add some dimension and a pattern to it. So I'll do this with each of the leaves. Add a few white die cuts to the back of the colorful die cut. Line it up with our background, but offsetting it just a little bit so the white peeks out. After adding all of those stacked die cuts, I'll trim off the edge and then use a sanding block just to kind of smooth off the edges. This gives a nice finished look to the edge and will look great when we glue it onto our white note card. So this background that I created is slightly smaller than 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches. And I'll add it to a white note card that is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches. And we'll have a little trim around the edge. You could leave this as is. This is called like an eclipse technique. There are some other names for it too. But I really wanted to make those olive branches or olive leaves stand out even more. So I'm lightly rubbing ink over those raised die cuts. I used the same colors of ink that I used on the background. So some blue ink, some teal ink, and some green ink. I'm not pressing this down firmly, just applying a light amount of ink over the raised areas. In fact, I didn't use an ink pad. I just used the ink that is still on my ink blending tool from the last time I used it. That helps to make those die cuts stand out even more on the background, but it allows the background to show through nicely too. I wanted to use a large bold sentiment on this background, so I chose the new Simon Says Stamp Spring in My Step stamp set. This is a large set with lots of large greetings. I encourage you to take a closer look at it, as there are many great greetings in here that are unusual and fun to add to any card. Now I chose the Hello Gorgeous, and we're going to gold heat emboss that on white cardstock, but I'm going to show you a trick that'll allow it to stand out even more. I have my MISTI stamping tool here. You could use any stamping platform or an acrylic block if you prefer. I have white cardstock and I'm using my anti-static powder tool on it so that we can get crisp embossing results. I'm inking up Hello Gorgeous with Versamark ink and pressing that onto the white cardstock, and then adding some gold embossing powder. Now, when I heat set this, we'll have a nice heat embossed image. But as you know, when you heat emboss a large sentiment like this, you might get a little bumpy effect to your embossing. I thought it'd be great to make this stand out more by giving it a domed, raised, smooth result. To do that, I am putting that same image back into my MISTI in the same spot, giving it a few minutes to cool, using my anti-static powder tool again, inking up my stamp with the Versamark ink once again, and stamping right on top of the embossing we already did. I will now add another layer of gold embossing powder, and we'll heat set this. This will give us smoother results and a little bit more dimension. But I'm really going to step it up and do a third layer. So I'm going to repeat the process again, doing a third layer of gold embossing. When I heat set that, we'll have smooth, domed results that really stands out nicely. It's a big difference between the 3 layers and the 1 layer, and I encourage you to try it if you have a large heat embossed sentiment like this one, or you really just want your sentiment to stand out against your card. Steps like this don't take much time, but make a big impact in the final result of the card. I used the coordinating die to cut out the Hello Gorgeous, and I used that die to cut 2 more white die cuts that I'll glue behind the heat embossed sentiment so it has dimension and it'll stand out against our background. I put some liquid adhesive on the back of this, added it to our card, along with some pearls and gems. Now I get asked a lot about the different pearls and gems I use. Most of them are from Trinity Stamps, Lucy's Cards, and Studio Katia, and I'll link to those 3 below. I like to use a mix on a card, so I use some green, blue, and teal little pearls and some gold satin pearls on my background to fill in some of the openings. You could definitely skip that if you wanted to, but I like how the pearls really pull out the mica spray that I used in the background and the gold heat embossing we did on the sentiment. You can see here close up how the heat embossing kind of has a domed look to it because we did the 3 layers. So one really fun way to step up your inked background is to do the eclipse technique, as I showed with this example. Okay, let's move on to our next example where I do a variation of the eclipse technique, this time doing something else to make it stand out on the background. Now for this card, I use the new Simon Says Stamp Sweet Birds stamp set. This is a great large stamp set that allows you to create 4 different birds. Now these aren't layering stamps, but rather building stamps that allow you to create something colorful, however you want. I chose to use the images on the top to create a blue bird. I have a MISTI Sticky Mat here that I've cut down a little bit smaller. I just find it easy to work with. And I have the negative space from the dies that work with this stamp set. And I put the negative space onto the sticky mat. I'm putting that right into the corner of my stamping tool. I'm popping in a die cut of the bird I plan to stamp. This will help to define the outside edges of our stamping because I'm using the outside edges of the die cut as a guide. So I lined up the first image and I'm stamping that with dye ink. This is Simon Says Stamp Saturated Ink. These blue colors are beautiful, but you could use absolutely any ink you want. I'll now move on to a next image. Sorry, my head gets in the way there, but I want to make sure these are really close together but not overlapping. It's really quite easy to make these line up. This time I wanted a lighter blue, but not super light. So I chose a light blue ink and I'm stamping it multiple times to make it a bit darker. If you don't have multiple shades of the same color to do an image like this, try double, triple, or quadruple stamping an ink to make it darker. It gives you more options. Okay, so now I'm choosing another color of ink to stamp this image here, and then we will move on to the rest of the images. I used 3 ink pad colors here, but it looks like I used more in the end. So I continued to line up the other images of the bird and stamp them, including the eyes and the beak. For the background, I'm using this inked piece that I created in my last video using dye inks, cardstock, and a brayer. I love these abstract backgrounds and I thought it would look great for the backdrop on this card. I used the Simon Says Stamp Tattered Leaf die, the one that you see here, to cut twice from the background. Again, I'm doing the eclipse technique like I showed you on the last one. However, we're not covering the whole background and I'm going to change it up in the end. So I'm keeping all of the die cut pieces over there on my sticky mat so I don't lose them. I'm now gluing this negative space onto a piece of white cardstock of the same size, which is a little bit smaller than 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. You could cover that solid white piece with double-sided adhesive and lay this on top, which would leave all those openings with exposed adhesive that you could pop the die cuts in. It's up to you how you do it. I just thought the liquid adhesive was easy enough so I can wiggle the pieces in place before I press them down. Now off screen, I completed the background. I did the eclipse technique as I showed you with our last example, where I glued white die cuts behind the colorful one and lined them back up on the background. I'm just omitting it to save some time in the video. This time I'm going to show you another way to make the raised eclipse areas stand out more. So I have this note card and I'm putting it onto a sticky mat that I cut down and then onto my Tim Holtz media grip. I talked all about this in my last video. Be sure to check it out. It's a great way to hold your project still as you add inking. I'm using my Tim Holtz brayer to apply white pigment ink over the raised areas, over those die cuts. By applying white ink over these die cuts, we're softening them, which allows them to stand out more from the colorful background. Last time we added darker ink on the raised areas. This time I'm adding lighter ink. Last time I used an ink blending tool. This time I used a brayer. It's totally up to you what option you use. Just use whatever you have. So now I'm just going to kind of buff that white ink to smooth it out and look how the leaves stand out even more. For a sentiment, I'm using the Simon Says Stamp All About Mom stamp set. There are great mom sentiments in here, but keep in mind, you could leave the words mom uninked and have the messages you are beautiful, you are the best, thanks, and get more life from the stamp set. I chose to use You Are Wonderful along with the coordinating die, and I stamped that with black ink. So here is a look at our completed card. By doing that eclipse technique and rubbing a little bit of white ink over the raised area, we're allowed to show a lot of that abstract inking technique that we used, but also add some interest and some texture. All I did was add the bird, the sentiment, and some pearls, and we're good to go. So this is something that you can do with any inked background that you may create to add a bit of texture and interest. Okay, let's move on to something completely different. This time I used a piercing plate along with an inked background to create colorful texture, but I have a trick to make the pattern stand out even more. I'm starting with this inked background from my last video. I created this on cardstock using dye inks and a blending brush. Just a quick rainbow blending. Now we're going to soften it and add a pattern to it with a detailed piercing plate. Now on this card I'm using 3 dies. First we have the Simon Says Stamp Tattered Leaves over on the left, the Simon Says Stamp Big Friend there in the center, and then the piercing plate we're using on the background is the detailed mandala plate that's over on the right. I love dies like this because it just creates a pierced pattern on your background, which adds a little bit of texture, a little bit of detail, and is great for techniques. I am temporarily taping to it a piece of white cardstock that is 5.5 by 4 inches wide. I will run this through my die cut machine. You can use any die cut machine you have. This will cut around the outside edge, but then just create a pierced pattern on the cardstock itself. Now you can just do this where you use it like you normally would a die. But if you want to enhance that pattern and make the holes stand out a bit more, you want to make an impression also with the die. So after cutting with it, which you just saw me do, I have my embossing mat in my die cut machine. And I'll take the cardstock, my die, making sure it's still lined up in the same way, and then my embossing plate on top. Just follow whatever instructions your machine shares for embossing with the die. So that presses the die into it, making those holes stand out a bit more. You could skip that second part, but I really feel like it makes a big difference. Now I have some of that inked background that we created, and I'm positioning it towards the bottom center of our detailed plate here. Once again, I'll tape it in place and run it through our die cut machine as we normally would do with any die. This will pierce all the holes. Then I will run it through again, but use the embossing mat, which is flexible and allows you to emboss with the die instead of cut, which just enhances or makes the dots stand out even more. So here's a closer look at that ink blended background with the piercing pattern added. I love that it adds a lot to it, but doesn't overpower the color. I wanted to make those dots stand out even more, and one way to do that is to apply light mount ink over the raised areas. So I'm putting our ink and textured piece right onto my sticky mat and laying that right onto our media grip. Now this is like I did in the last video. You don't need to use those surfaces. All you need to do is use a brayer and some white pigment ink and lightly go over the piece. Now this ink will land on the raised areas, but not on those little dots that we just pierced. So it allows a pattern to stand out more. You can apply a lot of white ink or a little. You could apply colors, whatever you want. But I thought the white would be nice because the colors will still be showing through, but just will be softer. Now I'm putting glue on the back of this piece, and I'll line it up with our white pierced background so that the pattern is continuous over the white and the colored piece. I have a stacked die cut that I created with the Simon Says Stamp Tattered Leaves die. So it's 3 white die cuts thick, and I'm gluing that onto our background. And then I'm adding a friend die cut that I cut the shadow from white and the word friend itself from a champagne glitter cardstock from Memory Box. And I'm gluing that right over the background and the tattered leaf die. I also wanted to add some little sparkles around our leaf die cut, and I wanted to use the same glitter paper that I used on our friend die cut. So I took a scrap of that glitter paper, and I'm cutting it with this Hero Arts Confetti background die. Any die that cuts tiny little circles will work great for this. You could even use a center of flowers, anything to create small circles. So I have a bunch of little circles that I created with that champagne glitter cardstock. Then I have a bunch of circles that I created with white cardstock. Those are over on the left. I'm gluing the little white cardstock circles scattered around my card. I will then glue a glitter cardstock circle on top of it. By stacking those die cuts, these will stand out a little bit, and they look like faux gems or faux pearls, but they will match our die cut sentiment perfectly. So if you don't have gems or pearls or any kind of sparkle to add to your card, you can also just do tiny little glitter paper die cuts. So here's a closer look at the completed card, and I matched it up with a khaki metallic envelope from Simon Says Stamp. So we took that ink blended rainbow background and stepped it up by using a detail embossing plate and then rubbing some white ink over it to make that pattern stand out even more. You can see how the pattern is continuous from the white note card to the colorful area there on the bottom middle. Okay, let's move on to our next example. This time I'm taking a kind of watercolor looking inked background and stepping it up with a little bit of embossed resist and softening it once again. I'm starting with an inked background from my last video that I made with distress ink and lots of water. I want to do heat embossing on it, so I'm putting my MISTI Sticky Mat into my MISTI stamping tool. That will help hold the cardstock in place as we stamp on it. I'm using the Simon Says Stamp Handlettered Friends background stamp. I love this stamp. I've used it many times. I'm just putting it into my MISTI and closing the door on it. I use my anti-static powder tool on the ink surface, and I'm laying it onto our stamp, making sure it's straight. I will then close my MISTI upside down, and the sticky mat will grab the inked piece and hold it straight so we can stamp on it straight. I will use Versamark ink to ink up the entire stamp, and then I'm adding clear embossing powder. Now this clear embossing powder will trap that colorful ink underneath it and also make it a little bit darker and shiny wherever you did the clear embossing. This is a simple and easy way to step up this background, but we'll do more to it in a moment. Next, I have the Simon Says Stamp You're on My Heart die set. It includes the word die and the shadow die that you see on the left. I'm cutting the words from the top center of our background. I'll put an adhesive on the back of the negative space and glue it right onto a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch top folding white note card. The letters are still over there in the die, the letters that I cut out from our background. I glued the letters onto additional white die cuts for some stack dimension. And now I'm gluing that onto a white shadow die cut. This will allow it to stand out against our background. But I looked at my background and I really wanted more variation, and I wanted the text that we clear heat embossed to show even more. So I took a blending brush and white pigment ink and I just applied it in the corners kind of randomly here. I will then buff the extra ink off, and notice how that makes that hand lettering pattern stand out more, and it creates more soft spots in our background. You could use colored ink if you want. I chose to use white since I've already glued it to my white card, and I knew that wouldn't show up along the edges. So you'll just buff off that extra ink. The heat embossing will resist this ink we're putting on top. And now you can see that handwritten pattern in the background a bit more. Now we can glue that layered die cut right over the opening on our background. No one will ever know that we cut from the background. And you can see how it really is continuous in color between the background and the sentiment, and it matches perfectly. I did add a glitter heart right to the center there for some sparkle. This design really allows a lot of that background to show. The background that we created very quickly with distress ink, mica spray, and water in our last video. Then we added heat embossing and a little bit of white pigment ink for resist. And that really makes that background stand out. Okay, another way to step up your inked background is to do a little bit of masking, or you could use a stencil if you wanted. I have this inked background from the last video that I created with distress inks direct to paper for a really quick blended look. Now we're going to step this up by doing some masking. I used the Simon Says Stamp Daisy and Leaves die, a new favorite of mine, and I cut it several times from masking paper. I'm then putting those masks onto our inked background and just kind of positioning them close together. So all of those white die cuts are just masking paper. We'll remove them later. This technique is a great one to use with any dies you have and allow you to get more from your dies. So we're not actually doing die cutting on this card. We're just creating masks with our die. If you haven't tried this, I highly recommend it. It really works especially well with intricate dies like this one. So once I've covered my background with these masked die cuts, it's time to add some inking on top. I have my Tim Holtz media grip that I'm going to stick to my glass surface. Then I have my sticky mat that I'm putting on the back of our inked piece, and then I'll press that onto the media grip. This will just hold it in place as we do our inking on top. You could skip this if you want to. I do talk about this more in our last video. I did use a clean brayer to make sure that my masks are really stuck to the background. By the way, before you apply masks onto an inked background, you need to make sure the inking is 100% dry. Heat setting will assure that. All right, so now on top of this, I'm applying distress ink of the same color that I used to create the original piece. So I'm using some picked raspberry, abandoned coral, and also I believe it's the Kitsch Flamingo. So I'm just applying the same colors on top, but with a heavier hand. So kind of doing the coral on top of the coral color, the pink on top of the pink color, and just making it a bit darker. You do not need to take effort to do any great blending here. The technique is very forgiving. Once you're done, you can remove the mask from the background and you'll see that subtle daisy pattern added. If you want it to stand out more, you could do a darker ink on top. I wanted something very subtle. All right, so I don't want to cover this up because I really like this background. So instead, I'm just going to heat emboss a sentiment right in the center and call it a day. So I made sure it was completely dry by heat setting it. Then I used my anti-static powder tool. And then I'm white heat embossing a sentiment right in the center. Now this is from the Simon Says Stamp XL Spring Greeting Set, which I'll show you in a moment. I will then add white embossing powder and heat set it. I want to add another layer of heat embossing to this, but notice my cardstock is warping. To keep it from warping, I'm going to stick the sticky mat on the back again. I can use the sticky mat over and over, and that will hold it flat, which will help to make sure I get a really nice crisp image because the paper won't shift. So I use my anti-static powder tool, inking up our stamp once again with Versamark ink, and stamping right on top of the embossing we've already done, and adding another layer of white heat embossing. I will do this for 3 layers, and we will end up with a beautiful domed, smooth white sentiment that will stand out really nicely against our inked background. Here's a closer look at how smooth, domed, and shiny that embossing is. If you have never tried doing layered embossing on bold sentiments like this, please give it a try. It's worth the effort. I wanted to match our envelope to our card since this is a pretty simple card. So I've masked off the flap of a pink envelope, and I'm using the Simon Says Stamp Daisies and Leaves stencil that coordinates nicely with the die we used for our background. I'll tape that in place and lightly apply pink ink over the stencil so we have that pattern on our flap. I could have just used those daisy and leaf die cut masks we created earlier and used those on the envelope flap, but to be honest, I didn't think of it at the time and I already threw them away. I should have saved them with my die packaging so I could use them again in the future. But I thought this stencil worked really nice and was very quick to do to add a little bit of inking onto that envelope flap. So here's a look at our completed card. Very simple design, clean yet bold, but by using that inking technique to step up that background with our die cut mask, it really stands out nicely. Also, adding the 3 layers of embossing powder to the sentiment really helps that to pop too. By the way, this is the Simon Says Stamp XL Spring Greetings stamp set that I used on this card. It has lots of large, bold greetings. All right, our next example is to step up our inked background by doing a bit of stenciling on top. This is one of those simple techniques that I often forget about. I have an inked background I created in my last video using Distress ink and water. I'm putting that onto my Brutus Monroe sticky mat and then laying on top of that the Simon Says Stamp Fanfare stencil. The sticky mat will hold my cardstock in place and the stencil, keeping it still as I apply ink over it. Once again, I'm using the same colors of Distress ink to apply color on top of the background. I did add in some purple to this so there'd be a little bit more dark color, but you can just match up with whatever you used underneath. You're just putting a heavier amount of that color on top, so you'll have kind of a tone-on-tone look that varies along the background. Very fast to do, but a great way to step up your background and take something that's simple and give it some detail. Turning this into a card was very easy. I used the Simon Says Stamp Olive Leaves die to create 2 stacked white die cuts that I glued right into the background. I used the Simon Says Stamp Big Friend for the sentiment, and I used black glossy cardstock for the friend so it has some shine. I did also add some silver gemstones that will catch the light nicely. And then I have a You Are the Best black reverse sentiment strip. Those are super easy to use and a great way to quickly add a sentiment to your card. They have these in many sentiments, including regular and reverse. Okay, my last few cards are ones where I left the background as is and just added some finishing touches to the front. I really feel when you have a really bold inked background like this one, sometimes it's best to just add white on top. So I used the Poppy Stamps Flower Field Frame die. I cut that 3 times from white cardstock, glued it together for a stacked look, and glued it onto the background. I then added different colors of pearls to match our background to the center of each of those flowers. I white heat embossed Thank You for Being You from the Simon Says Stamp Step into Spring stamp set that I showed you earlier. And I did 3 layers of embossing so that the white sentiment would stand out nicely. I really think when you have a bold, colorful background like this, white die cuts really pop even more. So this is a very simple design and a great way to use those bold backgrounds. Now I had this one that I created from Distress Oxide ink, water, and mica spray. It was fast to do. Again, that's in my last video also. I didn't want to do anything to really change this card too much. So I just added some simple texture using that mandala detail plate as I showed you earlier. I used the plate directly onto our inked background. You don't see it from this kind of view, but when you look close, you can see that detailed piercing pattern in the background. It doesn't take away from the background, just adds a look of texture to it. I added a stacked white tattered leaves die cut coming from the top of the card. Then I added my friend's die cut, You Are So Kind sentiment strip. And then you see those little sparkly flowers? I used that flower field die from Poppy Stamps to cut from gold glitter cardstock. And then I cut the little flowers off and glued them onto our background. That was a great way to get more use from that flower field frame and add some sparkle to this card. Here's another background from the last video that I didn't want to step up. I wanted to leave it as is because I really like the results. I used dye ink, a little bit of water, and some mica spray to create this background. It was so fast to do, and I'm really happy with it. So I decided to trim it down and add a little to it, but allow a lot of it to show. So I have a note card here where I used the mandala detail plate on the background. I added our inked background piece on top of that with 2 silver cardstock strips above and below to look like a mat. I added 2 of the Simon Says Stamp Olive Leaves layered die cuts, the friend die cut, but this time with silver cardstock for the friend, and a sentiment strip. This allows a lot of the background to show, but it still has the added details on top. All right, there you have it. A lot of ways to take your inky backgrounds, step them up a bit with eclipse technique, inking, masking, stenciling, and more. I hope you'll give this a try. Sometimes if you have a background you're not really happy with, if you do some of these step it up techniques, you'll be happy with it in the end. Again, be sure to check out yesterday's video first. It really was helpful in coming up with these backgrounds. I thank you for spending this time with me. The supplies are linked in the YouTube description below. You can find much more information on my blog, which I'll link here at the end, along with 2 other inky background videos. Thanks for watching. I appreciate your time as always, and have a wonderful day.